Hello everyone and welcome to the Wacko Prophet podcast. My name is Imran. Here in the Wacko Prophet podcast, you get to hear my amateur but in-depth impressions, opinions and reviews on movies, TV and web series, books and games. All things fiction. If you'd care to check my previous podcast episodes, you'll see that I've already done a 10-part impressions and review series on the YouTube-led and Netflix show Cobra Kai Season 1, where I talked about what I liked and disliked about each and every episode of that show. Each podcast episode on that is approximately 20 minutes long. Other than that, I also did one special episode which was about 40 minutes long, talking about the Netflix horror anthology by Mike Flanagan, The Haunting of Bly Manor. So I guess it's fair to say that I'm somewhat new to the game. I started this podcast relatively recently, back in early September 2020. Last week, upon completing Season 1 of Cobra Kai, I spoke on wanting to do an episode or two on some movies, specifically movies released in the early 2000s. I took some suggestions on my personal social media pages and I also talked a bunch with my close friends, and I have come to the following conclusion. I'll be doing a 9-part podcast series on the Harry Potter movies, from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, released in 2001, all the way to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, released in 2011. I will be dedicating one podcast episode per movie, so that's 8 podcast episodes released on a weekly basis, plus the one you're listening to right now, which will serve as an introduction of sorts. So again, that's 9 podcast episodes. It may go to 10 because once I'm done with all 8 movies, I may want to do a separate conclusion episode as well, depending on how much I have left to talk about. As of now, I'm unsure how long each podcast episode will be. I want to make it long enough that I can get all my thoughts and opinions across, but also not too long as to go into just untethered rambling territory, where the average listener may find it incomprehensible. So I'll be trying to find a balance between the two. So as I said previously, this particular episode will be the introduction. So spoiler alert before you proceed. I can't imagine why anybody would even be interested in listening to this podcast episode, let alone get this far, without having read the Harry Potter books and seen the movies. But if you do belong to that category, and you're just here because you're a massive fan of the Wacko Prophet, or you just think my voice is nice, I have to warn you. Please do not proceed beyond this point if you care at all about the Harry Potter movies and books in terms of spoilers. I'll be talking about them and going into spoiler territory pretty much right from the get-go. So again, to this weird demographic of people who are still listening to me but have not watched or read Harry Potter, this is a fair warning. Okay, great. Let's get into it. So as you may know, especially if you're a 90s kid like I am, Harry Potter started off as a young adult fantasy novel series written by one Joanne Kathleen Rowling, so J.K. Rowling for short. That's how she presented herself, presented her name in the books. She published 7 books over the course of a decade, from 1997 to 2007, with each book detailing the exploits of one Harry Potter and his friends in a single school year in Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. In the world she had built, witches and wizards spent 7 years in wizarding school, from when they are 11 years old to when they are 18. The books got adapted into a movie franchise by Warner Brothers, with the first movie coming out in 2001, and has been, for the most part, successful at properly translating a pretty detailed fictional world into some very successful Hollywood blockbusters. In this podcast series, I'll primarily be focusing on the movies, while also bringing up some key differences there may have been between them and the source material, the books. It will also mostly be deep cuts, meaning I'll be going into detail about some things that the casual Potter fan may not really be aware of, but I'll try to keep it as user-friendly, so to speak, as possible. So, why did I choose Harry Potter as my subject for the next couple of episodes, for the next 9 or so episodes? Well, obviously, because I myself am a massive Harry Potter fan. Books and movies both. I have been one for close to 20 years now. I'm 30 years old, so I've been a Harry Potter fan for most of my life, for 2/3 of my life. The book series is what really reignited my then floundering love for reading, while it also gave me a boost in my confidence and vocabulary when it comes to the English language. And it also gave a pretty stable foundation to my opinions and my ideas about life in general. I'll tell you what I mean during the course of this episode. I was an impressionable youth when I came across the books and the movies, and I was impressed by them. For the better, for most part. So, since this episode is really about my introduction to the franchise, let me talk about how that happened. So in other words, let me tell you exactly how I came across and fell in love with the franchise that is Harry Potter. My first exposure to Potter was through the movies, not the books, which I'm sure to any other die-hard Potter fan can be a bit surprising. This was, I'm going to say, back in 2001 or 2002. I was 11 or 12 back then, and we had a VCR player, not a DVD player. And my brother and I would visit this small, dingy little VCR rental shop in the town closest to our home. And we would rent whatever movie we thought looked cool. We didn't really do it on a weekly basis. It was more of an occasional thing, maybe once every fortnight, maybe. So we would go there with our father usually, because our father knew the owner of the VCR shop, and we would rent a random movie. And when we chose what to rent, we would mostly go by how cool the movie poster looked and the recommendation of the guy behind the counter. Remember, back in 2001 or 2002, we did not have internet, at least not in the way that we have it now in 2020. And I didn't even have a cell phone, let alone a smartphone. I don't think smartphones were even a thing back then. So I barely knew what Harry Potter even was. Somehow, we ended up renting Harry Potter. That's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the first movie. I think my brother and I liked the cover and thought it looked awesome, which is why we rented that particular VCR cassette. So we paid the 50 rupees and we brought the cassette home. Back then, you were allowed to keep the rental for about 2 days, and if you return it later than that, there'd be late fees. Think of it like borrowing a book from a library. We didn't need to give any kind of information or of our identification because, like I said, the owner was a friend of our father's, and we also had been renting from them for about a couple of years, so they knew exactly who we were. So we get home, we pop the cassette in, we rewound it all the way to the beginning. Yeah, back then you had to actually rewind the VCR cassettes. Ask your parents or Google this if you have no idea what I'm talking about. So we did that and we watched the movie. And I loved it because the first movie is a solid movie directed by Chris Columbus, and it really nails that feeling of magical mystery and childhood wonder in about a 2.5-hour movie. So it's excellent. So I absolutely loved it. I loved the world, I loved the characters, the weird accents, all of it. But it was just another good movie. I didn't think much of it. It didn't really register as something life-changing. I really thought it was a good movie. I loved it. And then we returned the VCR copy and I forgot about it. I had it in the back of my head, but I was by no means thinking about it. Okay, a couple of years later, the VCR guy told us that the sequel is out in one of our occasional visits. Hey, cool, we thought. So I was alone this time. That is to say, I was with my father and my brother was out there probably doing some schoolwork. So I rented it alone this time. So I came home with my dad, rewound the VCR again, remember, because this was a VCR, you had to rewind it, and played it. Only this time, and I remember this very vividly, the VCR guy had put the wrong cassette in the VCR cover. So we had these cardboard covers that you slip kind of like sleeves that you slip the VCR into. And the VCR said on the spine of the VCR, kind of like on the spine of a book, on the spine of the VCR it said Harry Potter 2, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. But the VCR guy had obviously made some kind of mistake because it was not Harry Potter 2. It was a movie called Bridge to Terabithia. So, what can you do? You're not going to be able to return it. I mean, you've already spent 50 rupees and you've already rented a movie. So that's that. So I watched the movie and it was an excellent movie. I cried like a little baby because that movie is a kid's movie, but hell, it had a sad conclusion. I won't spoil it for you if you want to actually check it out and you've been living under a rock for the last 2 decades. But it was amazing and it was also very heartbreaking. I cried my eyes out and then I returned it. So when I did return it, I told the VCR guy that he'd made a mistake. Got the actual movie, but I had to pay 50 rupees more because turns out I had rented a movie, I had watched it, so it still counted as a good rental. So I paid 50 bucks more along with my dad and brought the actual Chamber of Secrets home. If I recall correctly, when I returned Bridge to Terabithia, they didn't have the actual Chamber of Secrets right then and there. I had to wait a couple of days, about a week I think, until they came back to me or until we went back to the shop, and then they had the proper Chamber of Secrets. So there's that. So then I got home and then I put the cassette in. Turns out this time it was the right title. It was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And again, a pretty good movie. More action-packed. Made an impression, again. But yeah, nothing more than some good story. Didn't think much of it again. I enjoyed the sequel more than the original. I remember that very distinctly as well. But other than that, other than thinking, man, this is a good film series, I can't wait for the next movie, I didn't really think much of it. I had maybe heard of the books in passing, maybe in the news when they mentioned it, and it kind of registered in my brain, but nothing more than that. It's important to know that at this point, I was into reading just a little bit, but most of my books were the Enid or Enid Blyton books. Remember those? The famous 5 books and the Secret 7 books, that sort of thing. So very much children's books and very much light reading. I wasn't into reading as much as I am now. And then, I believe in 2003, so we are about 2 or 3 years down the line here, I kept seeing this advert on TV where they kept talking about a book launch that was going to happen in Sri Lanka for a Harry Potter book. I paid so little attention that that's all the information I took out of it. That and the cover of the book. I remember the advert would show the book cover and it was a yellow and red cover with a bird, a phoenix, as I later found out, a phoenix drawing in the front, because this was, of course, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the 5th book in the series. Went completely out of my head. I did not care. I saw that a couple of times on a channel that showed a bunch of cartoons. I remembered the cover and I remembered that there was this thing happening, but other than that, it did not cross my mind at all. Remember, I was a very light, casual reader, as much as a 13-year-old can be. But turns out, my brother cared. He saw it, he paid attention, and he was interested in it, and he genuinely gave a shit. Now, my brother is Dilshan. He's 2 years elder to me, but I don't know, I always call him Dilshan. It didn't really occur to me to call him anything else. He's a smart one in the family. So he kept asking my parents to take us to the book launch. He had promised my dad that he didn't actually want my dad to buy him the book, but he really wanted to go to the launch event. It was a school day, a Wednesday, I believe. And as I found out later, because I didn't know where the hell we were going or why until we got there, the book launch was taking place at a venue called Delhi Mart in the World Trade Center building in Colombo. Now, this was a massive building that they had built only a couple of years ago. So I was really interested in seeing it because as a kid, Sri Lanka is not exactly a first world country. We're pretty far ahead now. We've caught on to all the technology. But back then in 2003, we were pretty much a third world country. So massive skyscrapers were not something that you saw every day. So I was really interested in going there when I found out that it was in the World Trade Center. So I was kind of excited there as well. Also, Delhi Mart was this fancy food place that was not somewhere that I'd usually go, or a place that my parents would take me. No complaints, but that was just a little too pricey for us. We were, after all, a middle-class family. We still are. So Delhi Mart was definitely a step up from what I'm usually used to when I'm thinking of eating out. Anyway, when we do finally get there, after school, remember, we are still in our school uniform, and I'm tired, we're both tired, and my dad and my mom, I believe, take us there at around, let's say, 5 o'clock in the evening. And when we do get there, I guess my brother actually changed his mind, and he said no. he actually wants them to buy the book as well. Now, book releases, I can't speak for all book releases, but I specifically remember when it came to Harry Potter and when it came to book releases, they would release the hardcover of the book first. The paperback would come later, much later. So the hardcover, being more durable and more fancy looking, is quite a bit more expensive than the paperback. I mean, Harry Potter books were expensive anyway, but hardcover versions of them were even more expensive than usual. So that was not a normal ask. But my brother was suddenly asking my dad to buy the book for him. To be fair, Dilshan didn't usually put my parents in that kind of position. He was a very well-behaved dude. He still is. At 32, he still is. I was the whiny one, and I'm 30, and I still am. I am, and I was the whiny one. But yeah, when we were there, he was almost begging my dad to please get the book for him. I did not give two shits. It was after school, like I said. I was really hungry, like I said, and we were in a somewhat upper-class food place. Fuck that book. I wanted to eat. I didn't make too much of a fuss though. I just kept saying that I'm quite hungry because I was. So after about 30 minutes of my brother trying to convince my dad finally turns to me and he says, now this is how I remember it. My parents may dispute it and my brother may definitely dispute it. But as I remember, after about 30 to 45 minutes of my brother bugging my dad would turn to me, more or less, he said, okay, you choose, Imran. Either we get this book or all four of us eats from Delimart. So that was the easiest decision that I had to make in my life. I said, hell yes, let's eat. This is Delimart. It looks amazing. And the food looks really good. And I'm definitely not going to come here anytime soon. So yeah, let's eat. I didn't even consider buying the book. Fuck that. That's a massive book. I can't read that shit. So we eat. And yet, bless my big brother, he still manages to convince my dad to get the book. I don't even notice. I'm busy whacking away at all that great food. So I'm happy. My brother is happy. And my dad is not too happy, but yeah, he wasn't complaining that much. Or maybe I was too full to hear him complaining. We get the book. We get home. We take a bus, I think, because both of us pretty much got what we want. I got my food and my brother got his book. So we were not getting any kind of taxi home. We took the bus and we were completely cool with it. So we get home and I check out immediately. I'm tired as hell, I'm full, and I fall asleep. Done. Next day, I come home after school at around, I think, 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. My brother is off doing something extracurricular and I don't have any homework. So what do? I remember that absolutely massive book he made our dad buy the previous night. I crack it open and I start reading. And I am hooked. I'm absolutely hooked. I finished the book in about a week or two. I loved it, but I'm also thoroughly confused because yeah, you're hearing that right. The very first book I ever read from the Harry Potter series is The Order of the Phoenix, the fifth book. It's like if you're learning to swim, but you went right from the kiddie pool right into the deep end and somehow you loved it despite having missed some pretty fundamental lessons on swimming. That's how I felt, and I didn't die. I loved it, but I knew that I was missing a whole lot of context. For example, who the hell is Sirius Black? Who's Cedric Diggory? And how did he die? You know who is back? Harry saw his parents and there was some weird worm thing going on? People are actually dying? I had so many questions. I wanted to know so badly. I had been, by my own hand, dumped into this massive, living, breathing world that I only had a hint of through the first two movies. And so much was happening and I was so invested in all of it turning out okay. But I was completely clueless. So I did the only thing that could be done. The sanest thing that could be done. I bought Harry Potter 1 through 4 and I read all of them. Now that's pretty logical. I've read 5, I'm waiting for 6 and I wanted to read the rest. So I bought Harry Potter 1 through 5. But the way I went about it was not very logical at all. I bought them in reverse order. Meaning, I bought and read 4 and 3 first. Read them in that order. So I read Goblet of Fire, which is the 4th book, and then Prisoner of Azkaban, which is the 3rd book. And then I got 2 Chamber of Secrets, read that. And then finally, book 1, Philosopher's Stone. Now, I know that sounds a bit ass backwards, but in my defense, it did actually ease me into the books relatively well. Having read Order of the Phoenix first, it would have been too jarring to go straight to Philosopher's Stone, which, for all intents and purposes, is a children's book. So that transition would have completely thrown me off. I found it much easier, and the world kind of unraveled itself in a more detailed way, or in a more gradual way, I suppose, when I read it backwards. Because all the mysteries that I had found in Order of the Phoenix, by way of not reading the previous books, were unraveled one by one. And I had a general idea of what Harry Potter 1 and Harry Potter 2 was about, having watched and remembered the movies. So I think that was the sanest way to do it. And I think that contributed massively to my continued loyalty to the series. So I did this. I read all 5 books backwards before the release of book 6, Half-Blood Prince. By the time of its release, I was a full-blown Potterhead. We got dial-up internet back at home with a modem, and I spent hours upon hours reading the forums that they had online about different theories, who they thought Harry's parents were, how important were they. I mean, by the 5th one, we had a pretty good idea of all of these things. But 2 books left to go, there was so much left to theorize about. A lot of people was trying to theorize how the series would end, what Harry's scar would mean, and all that. I remember poring over those and reading them over and over and kind of coming up with my own theories, and it was an amazing time. I discovered a world that I didn't really know existed. That was really the first time I had dived so deep into any world of fiction. Because remember, before Harry Potter, the heaviest reading I've done was Famous 5 and Secret 7. I am not kidding. I that was all I read. And even that, I didn't really collect all of the books and read them in order or whatever. I just read whatever was there in the library. So I liked reading, but it was a very casual hobby at best. When Half-Blood Prince did release, I believe I bought it on releasing day. I read it in about 5 days, and I really cared for the story. That was the first time that I had really doubled down and really given a shit about a work of fiction, really. So I was really invested. And then, in 2007, was Deathly Hallows. Remember, 2007, I was still at school. Now, here in Sri Lanka, we have a very basic school system, a pretty good but basic school system. And I was in my A-levels, in pretty much my last 2 years of schooling. And yeah, Deathly Hallows released right in the beginning of that last 2 years, at the end of the series. I remember pre-ordering this book and then getting the bus to go to a small city called Bambalapitiya, which is a suburb, I guess, of Colombo. Because the pre-booking that I did, and when I say pre-booking, this was not online. I did not have a smartphone of any kind. I had one of those phones with a number pad, a small Motorola. So I had to call MD Gunasena several weeks before and pay the amount several weeks before. We paid the full amount. It was like 4,000 odd rupees, if I'm not mistaken, and we pre-reserved it. So on the day of the launch, I got up super early. I got into a bus. My dad dropped me at the nearest bus station because our road was so out of the way, and it still is so out of the way that buses don't operate that early. My dad dropped me in his bike to the nearest bus station, which is about 4 kilometers away, and I caught the bus and I got to Bambalapitiya by around 6:30 a.m. in the morning, which is unheard of. Nothing opens in Colombo at that time for the public, at least not bookstores. But MD Gunasena was opening. It wasn't open by the time I got there. I got there by around 6:30, 6:45, I believe, in the morning, and they were just opening up. Did I stand in line? No, there was no line when I got there. I was that early. And they opened up for me, like I said. I got the book by showing the receipt of my payment, and I grabbed it. I let them put it in a plastic bag. I shoved it in my backpack, and I walked out. And by the time that I was walking out, there was a line. So I was literally the first person to get that book, at least from that store at that time. And you'd better believe I read that book in less than 24 hours. Now that's a nerd cred that I am still proud to pull out and flash. There's no way I can prove it, but take my word for it. I read that bitch in less than 24 hours. I remember it was a Saturday. I had finished the book by Sunday morning, around 5 a.m. So I got it at 6:30 a.m. and I finished it 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday, and I finished it by 5 a.m. on the next day. That was the very first time I had been so invested in a story, in a work of fiction, that I did not eat, I did not sleep, I barely slept. I slept for about an hour, and I refused to go to the bathroom without taking the book there. It introduced me to the concept that, yeah, a work of fiction can have an almost unhealthy hold over you. Yeah, it's all happening in your head, but it is very real to you. Most people in my life, in my school life I should say, did not understand. I think my parents understood. Both my dad and my mum had been avid readers in their youth. They were now working full time and had very little time to do anything else other than work and family life, but I suspect that they knew what I was feeling. My brother understood. He was in the same well of Potter that I was in. Once the books were finished, we would often have arguments about different topics for hours upon hours. I remember we were discussing Horcruxes. And remember, this is spoiler. So please, if you did not heed my warning before, heed it now. I'm going to talk about things that are pretty spoilery. So I remember me and my brother, we had this discussion about Horcruxes, because Horcruxes were basically Voldemort's way of not dying, his way of guaranteeing immortality. And he had created 7 Horcruxes because 7 was the most powerfully magical number. So he had created 7 Horcruxes, and Dumbledore, by the 6th book, Dumbledore was making guesses as to what these Horcruxes could be, because Voldemort was a bit of a drama queen and he wanted all objects that would be Horcruxes, vessels, that is to say, to be special objects. So it's a whole other thing, and I'll get into it in the podcast episode when I get to that particular movie. I remember we had a solid, I'm going to say 3 to 4 hour argument / discussion in the veranda of our house, where we were talking about what the possible Horcruxes would be, because the books didn't really make it clear. Very intentionally, the books didn't make it clear, crystal clear, what the 7 Horcruxes were. There was room for error in Dumbledore's guessing. So we spent hours upon hours discussing what the Horcruxes could be, and if Dumbledore had in fact missed anything. I remember we would talk about it, and then if we didn't remember a particular chapter in a particular book, we would bring that book in, open that chapter, read it there, and then we would say, okay, this is what this means. That's how much that book or those books took hold of us. So yeah, that was amazing. So my family pretty much understood, and I think my parents were pretty happy to see us nerding over a book, really, or a book series, really. So that was something good. But other than that, I had one English teacher at school who I think understood. He was as into reading as I am now, and I was back then. So I think he kind of understood as well. Other than that, nobody really understood what we were going through. What we were going through, I'm talking about is like, it was like a tragedy, but what we felt and what the experiences that we had just by reading that damn series. It was amazing. I'm not resentful towards people not understanding. It's just that in our age, it was really rare to see someone reading that much. Not that there were not other readers, there were, but when it came to Harry Potter, it was pretty much me in my grade, and my brother and maybe one other friend of his in his grade. So it was a pretty unique experience. I appreciated the hell out of it. I really wanted people to understand Harry Potter, but I also understood that this was something really special, and it made me, to be quite honest, feel pretty special as well. So there was that. So yeah, you have to understand, so many of my hopes were connected to those books. Within 3 to 4 years, I had gone from not even having this book in my orbit to being a die-hard Potter fan. And other than the excellent writing and really imaginative, crazy, but somehow relatable world, the thing that really struck me about the books, what really made me a fan, was the ability of the books and the characters in them to give voice to ideas that I've already had in my head, and sometimes present me with ideas that really help me form my opinions about certain controversial things. I have so many of the quotes from the book stuck inside my head even now, ready to be pulled out or spoken to myself at a moment's notice. Like, for example, "It is our choices, Harry, that show us what we truly are, far more than our abilities." That was something that I read in Harry Potter 2, spoken by Professor Dumbledore, I believe. Another example: "If you want to know what a man's like, take a look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals." Sirius Black, Harry Potter 4, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. "It's Leviosa, not Leviosa." Hermione Granger, Harry Potter 1. "Dumbledore's man through and through." Harry Potter to Albus Dumbledore, Harry Potter 5, Order of the Phoenix. "I can sing the freaking Hogwarts school anthem by memory. And I know the tune, because if you remember Harry Potter 1, Dumbledore allows everyone to sing the anthem in any tune they see fit. I even remember a time period in my life, a not inconsiderable time period of my youth, where I tried to remember the Sorting Hat songs. Because remember, each year the Hogwarts Sorting Hat in the books would have a different song that it would sing. And I'm not shitting you, I tried to memorize all the songs. I failed, but I genuinely tried, and I got 50% of the way there before I kind of gave up and just started reading the books again. That was how much of an impact the books had on me. So much of how I try to see things and how I try to see people are informed even now by the lessons I've learned from those books. I haven't always lived up to the standards I've set for myself, but I'm proud and nerdy enough and happy to say that I've always tried. Always. The idea that not everyone is pure good or pure bad, that everyone has a little gray in them. The idea that what you're born into doesn't define you. The idea that people can always change and the people can always try to do better. All of those ideas are things that I still cling on to, that I learned from those books. Potter also pushed me into serious reading territory as well. Had it not been for Potter, I suspect that I would still be relegated to some occasional light reading, instead of turning it into one of my most enduring hobbies. I haven't read the books in years, especially the first few bits, but I can still vividly remember how it felt to read them, and the story beats that took place in each individual book. It was, for all intents and purposes, a magical series for me, as it was for millions of others. So that's how much of an impact Harry Potter had had in my life. Now, those are the books. When it comes to the movies, while I do think that they are flawed, I also think that they did the best they could given the circumstances and given what they were asked to do in adapting a wildly popular and quite deep book series into a digestible blockbuster series, while also taking care not to dilute the material in the books too much, so as to render it meaningless or shallow. So it was an amazingly crazy balancing act. They did a lot of things right, and obviously I'll talk about what they did right and what they did wrong in detail when I get to each individual movie. But one thing that I like to shout out is the casting. The casting was always on point. There were several key characters that had to be cast perfectly in order for the whole series to work. Obviously, the first were the Golden Trio. That's Harry, Ron, and Hermione. If they had miscast any of those characters, it would have been disastrous. There are certain nitpicks that I'd like to have here, even for the Golden Trio, but overall, I think the three actors that they cast for the roles, that's Daniel Radcliffe for Harry, Rupert Grint for Ron, and Emma Watson for Hermione. I think all of them were amazing. There are certain nitpicks, but not when it comes to the actors, when it comes to how they chose to portray those three characters over the course of the movies. But when it comes to the actors themselves, I was quite happy with it. Dumbledore, they had to get Dumbledore absolutely right. Hagrid, they had to get Hagrid right. Severus Snape, Obviously, if you read the books and if you watched the movie, you know exactly why I'm talking about this. Severus Snape had to be perfect. If they had not been, then it would have been just over before it began. Second, they also had to get the tone right. The tone of the movies are imperative because the books had a very specific tone about them. They started off as children's books and they very gradually grew up along with the readers, I suppose, into being young adult fantasy fiction books. And they did it very gradually and they did it very organically. So the movies had to make sure that they got the tone correctly. Now, there are certain issues that I have with certain tones of some of the movies, but overall, I think they did a great job. So like I said, I have watched all 8 movies and I enjoy every single one of them, though I believe some are better than others. Obviously, it became harder to make cohesive, deep, good movies the more it went along, because the first 2 books were important, but I'd imagine it was easier to get the tone right and the story right in the first couple of movies because the books are relatively small. What made it hard, I believe, is from Goblet of Fire onwards, from the 4th book onwards, because that book is massive. The first 3 books are relatively small, easier to read and easier to digest. But the 4th book really takes a deep dive in terms of tone because it becomes objectively darker, and in terms of depth, because Goblet of Fire is where you really take a deep dive into the wizarding world. Because in the first 3 books, in Philosopher's Stone, Chamber of Secrets, and Prisoner of Azkaban, we are pretty much relegated to Hogwarts. The 4th book is where they really veer off that path and introduce us a broader wizarding world, because that's where the Quidditch World Cup takes place. And there's a whole bunch of things that happen before the characters even get to Hogwarts. So that's a much harder book to properly condense into a proper 2.5 hour or whatever feature-length movie. So I understand that it is not easy. Having said that, I believe that it could have turned out better, the movies, but it could have turned out a whole lot worse. I was invested in the movies quite a lot. Not as much as I was in the books, but I was invested in the movies and I really wanted to see them do right by the books. And for the most part, I'm happy to report that they did. I'd like to talk a lot about the movies right now and right here, but that is why we have a 9-part podcast series. This is it for the introduction. I hope you have an understanding of why I chose Harry Potter and why I have such a respect and such an understanding and such a love towards that book series and by extension that movie series. What you'll find in the next 8 episodes is a discussion on each movie, 1 episode at a time, where I will talk about the good in the movies, the bad in the movies, and some important stuff. My usual podcasting format. I may also talk additionally about certain differences between the books and the movies. And I talk about why they are good and they are bad as well. Because the books have the liberty of having a good writer. If the writer is good and if they tell it like it is, we will understand it like it is. If they tell us, for example, that Harry walked in front of the mirror of Erised and he saw his entire family, extended family, his father, his mother, their parents, the whole family tree behind him. Okay, that's understood. And they could say in a paragraph what this means and why it's important to Harry and why Harry sees it. They don't have that liberty in movies. In movies, you don't want monologues explaining why exactly everything is as it is. So I understand the fact that not everything in a book will translate as well if you take it word for word to a movie format. It's a completely different format and it requires a completely different type of showing, I suppose. So I completely understand why movies don't exactly copy books word for word. I'm well aware that people in the Harry Potter fan base want that. They want the book to be copied word for word or chapter to chapter. But I completely understand, this being a movie series, why that is pretty much impossible. You'll find out my opinions on each of the movies as we go on. So that's it for this episode. I think this went quite more than my usual episodes go. I believe this podcast episode will come to around 40 minutes. And I suspect that each podcast episode for each movie will go on for much longer than that. So I hope you like my voice, and I hope you like listening to it. And that's all we have. We are fast approaching the end of the year 2020, and good riddance to that year. I hope everything has been as well as it could be during this piece of shit of an year for you. It has been okay for me. I've managed to retain my day job. I have an amazing job and an amazing boss, so I've managed to stick the landing, and I'm pretty sure I'll be okay until the end of the year as well. I hope everyone out there who is listening to this has a relatively good year as much as you can. It is Christmas, and Harry Potter movies did always bring this Christmassy cheer, because they always show Hogwarts during Christmas, at least in the first couple of movies. I'm really looking forward to watching each of these movies again for what I feel like is 1,000th time each, and really talking about it and analyzing it for what is good and what is bad. And I hope you enjoy the journey with me. If you do have any feedback and any kind of opinion on what you want me to do, and anything that you think I should talk about in specific episodes, then please feel free to reach out to me. I will be leaving the links to all of my social media, that is my Twitter, my Instagram, my Facebook, in the description of this podcast episode. That would be a very good way to do it. This will be a weekly thing as usual. I'll be uploading each podcast episode at around 7 a.m. Sunday morning, Sri Lankan time. And you can also subscribe to my podcast. You can find it in every single podcast platform. Just search the Wacko Prophet, and you can find it quite easily. Also, I have a YouTube presence. Not much of a YouTube presence, but I am there for those of you who do not prefer to download a separate app and listen to podcasts on YouTube. I have a YouTube version of the podcast up and running as well. So again, it's the Wacko Prophet on YouTube as well. I'll leave the link to that in the description as well. So I'll see you next week with my impressions on Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Thank you very much for listening. This has been the Wacko Prophet podcast. I am the Wacko Prophet, and my name is Imran. You have yourself a lovely, magical